Okay, part two of this week's content, looking at punk struggles, classification, and naming in punk. So, when talking to people in this scene, it was kind of interesting to talk to them about whether they thought it was a scene or not, or what's the thing that unites them. And so here you have Asp talking about the idea that it's basically people that are kind of extreme music enthusiasts, really, really dedicated to kind of being outside the mainstream. So he kind of uses people that kind of go to the big day out as an example, like if you kind of going to kind of mainstream festivals like that, you would kind of assume that people are kind of into music, but there's a kind of distinction being made here that like it's not just people that kind of go to those, mainstream kind of rock festivals or whatever. It's people that kind of play and collect music and they kind of know about these kind of underground band, like, what used to be called the Friendsters, a band that's kind of disbanded, I think it's in, and they're kind of Sydney, they're obsessed with kind of this underground stuff. Dax talks about how it's about being a fanatic. It's just like, this is everything, being committed to this stuff as your life. And so both these guys are in bands that are relatively well known in the scene. And I asked Dax then, is it weird that people can't become fanatic about your stuff? But he says, yeah, but I'm a fanatic too. So I guess I can relate to it in some respects. So here you can see this kind of really speaks to this notion of illusio. It's investing yourself deeply and believing in not only the ethics of it, but then kind of knowing about the history of stuff, all that kind of thing in terms of how it becomes who you are as much as just something that you do. So when I asked them about, what would you call what's going on, they kind of, mostly of them said something like a scene. It's a scene, I don't know, but it's weird because, again, as I was kind of pointing out here, there's so many different styles going on. There's like metal and hardcore and kind of jangly rock and electronic music and all this kind of different genres of music, but they all kind of play on the same bills. Some of them are in different bands that play different styles of music. So he talks here about like when he's playing in this hardcore band, he often sees people in the crowd that have this kind of another band's shirt on that's a completely different style. And that's kind of weird. But he points out then that it's not just really about the sound. It's not as simple as just underground music. It's just music that's not popular. It's just good music. It's kind of, but then it's really hard to articulate what good music is. So it's going to kind of relates more to attitude of the people than the kind of sounds themselves. So it's hard to say what unifies the scene in that kind of sense. It's kind of elusive and ephemeral, but it's kind of more attitudinal than like genre-based or sound-based. So, as I said, this guy's in a particular, a lot of bands and it's at different levels. Some of them have kind of gone pretty quickly. Others have maintained. Some of them got kind of high levels of popularity and done overseas tours. And what's interesting about something like being in a situation like that is that even if you do dedicate yourself to being, independent DIY, pretty much as soon as you get beyond, just playing in your local pub or space or whatever and try and do other things like releasing records and, getting the word out there so people will actually know about them and maybe doing a tour or even particularly going overseas, is that you end up pretty much in one way or another being connected to the music industry. And that becomes kind of problematic for people like this that kind of don't really want to be part of that machine, but want to be able to kind of get around and play their music in front of people and particularly in front of like-minded people. So there's even kind of a struggle over the definition about what they actually do. Like, is what I do actually DIY, because as he describes here, one of his bands, has a distribution deal with what's kind of a label that has a connection to a major label. And so the kind of debates and kind of feelings about authenticity here become challenged as soon as you start having to deal with those kind of things. So he also talks here about how a band that he was in got kind of sponsored to play a gig that was like put on by Adidas. So they were given like $200, which is about, what they would get if they were putting on their own show anyway. And, they do this the first time and I actually might have been on a skate video or something, but like not playing a show, but like they do something the first time and like, not sure about this. And when they get asked again to do it later on, they just say no. So what's interesting about this too is there's a particular kind of consumerist politics that's embedded in this critique, as points out there, that like, asking kind of who's getting stuff out of this, he goes, well, Adidas is getting something out of it. Definitely not the lady that's kind of probably making the shoes in a sweatshop in Southeast Asia. So kind of there's a kind of reflexivity here about the immaterial labor that these bands are doing. Like, brands want the kind of coolness of this underground scene attached to them. The underground scene doesn't really want anything to do with it, but sometimes you kind of can't help but being caught up in the things that they're organizing, playing on a bill that's sponsored by these companies and stuff like that. So this means that the participants themselves start to question what they're doing, and not necessarily bagging other people when they do that kind of stuff. It's actually as much about like questioning what they're doing themselves, and is this DIY? Am I authentic? Am I doing the right thing? So again here, you can see how this relates to that notions of Lusio and social gravity. The importance of this stuff becomes about like a sense of self and an ethic of life. So again, similar conversation here around what is DIY, and how is it co-opted. So the guy I'm talking to here, has been involved in the scene for a long time. I think he was his late 20s when I spoke to him, and he'd been involved since his early teens. Has a kind of popular zine, plays in a bunch of bands. Again, what is DIY? It's not nearly a style, a sound, or a fashion. It's not necessarily a political ideology or identity. It's kind of a word that applies, this is a word that anyone can use, and it applies to any activity. Like, it becomes that kind of thing that this starts to annoy Dax. Points out that it's like, it should be about kind of collectivity, about kind of creating a sense of community with other people. And he points kind of examples in the past. I asked like Washington and hardcore in the 80s, and he says like English punk bands, and I think he's kind of referring to the band Crass there, that I've got the cartoon of the background of that slide. I suppose the idea was that DIY was coming from a sense of community where everything else was coming from a sense of industry. So it's an important kind of distinction here, that like the people in the DIY scene are doing it for themselves and for community and for kind of these authentic expression, where things outside of that are about the music industry, about money and about profit. So what he then points out, though, is how the very notion of DIY becomes co-opted by the music industry and by bands that aren't really DIY. People start calling themselves DIY when they're not, and this creates kind of consternation and debate and that kind of thing. So what Dax ends up doing himself is then kind of rejecting the label as well, because he doesn't want to be associated with the people that are co-opting it, and becomes a kind of completely different thing. He points out that in the end, after struggling with these kind of notions, he's abandoned the term himself. Around the scene, there was a kind of growth of bands, and there's a list of them there: Dick Diver, Twerps, Kitchen Floor, Bitch Prefect, a bunch of others that had a really kind of lo-fi, jangly, kind of catchy pop sound that was singing about day-to-day life as a young person in Australia more often than not. Really kind of lo-fi bands, quite catchy. So there's some links later on, you can check them out. And what happened is that as a kind of few of these bands started to kind of become popular within the scene, on the really, at the time, fairly important blog site called Mess and Noise, in the chat underneath one of the stories or something, or in the chat room, someone jokingly called these bands doll wave and kind of gave them a genre, for want of a better word. And people laughed about it, and it was like very funny. But it then kind of gets picked up, and people then start using the term to describe those bands, even if they're still taking the piss. It kind of, haha, it's a joke. But then it kind of gets picked up outside the scene more, and people start writing about it. People within the scene start writing about it. It becomes a bit more of a thing. And then even becomes stories about this scene or this genre in, major newspapers like The Guardian. So once that kind of happens, there's, again, more consternation about this stuff, like particularly people within the scene going, well, it's not really a thing. Dollwave doesn't exist. So like, as Jimmy Kritzler talks about here, and use a book we'll talk about later on, he wrote a 500-page book about what was going on in the scene and doesn't mention the term dollwave once. And I actually really agree with his quote there for the most part. I mean, it's a joke taken too far, critics struggling to link a batch of bands together. And so that's kind of true. And I agree with that critique in a way, but like, it's kind of out of people's in the scene's hands. It becomes a thing regardless of it. Now, how does that happen? Well, throughout the music history, there's been always contested kind of histories and debates over who named what and whether things should be named a particular way. And you can see a bunch of examples there about heavy metal and punk and twee and grunge and different stories about how these things come about. But, you know, those earlier examples tended to be kind of named by people with lots of cultural capital, in the sense that like they were writing in major magazines or they were part of the bands themselves. What's interesting about these recent ones, Dollwave, and there's one in America called Chillwave that happened on a blog as well, that they weren't actually named by people that were like major players in the scene. They were named by like anonymous posters on blogs underneath, you know, stories or in chat rooms about them. So there's an interesting kind of thing there that like there's a democratization in a way of like how this has kind of happened, but also those chats have disappeared. Like blogs are ephemeral, they go, and I think, you know, the hipster runoff thing where Chillwave was invented, I don't think it exists anymore. Mess and Noise is now defunct and gone. So the kind of history in that sense is disappeared, and all that's left is the kind of mainstream newspaper stories about it. So it's an interesting kind of change in the way that kind of stuff happens. But what did happen is the label stuck. And it wasn't created by prominent journalists, it's created by people in the scene themselves. It's kind of an ironic joke. What's interesting too is that artists generally don't like being classified. It's restrictive. They, you know, tend to want to kind of express themselves free of those kind of things in many ways. They particularly don't like being classified by people that like aren't like them or aren't doing the thing. So there becomes this kind of debates both in chat rooms, but also in written articles. And in the book, I kind of draw on 4 particular really well-written critical pieces about Dollwave. Again, some of those have actually disappeared off the internet now as the blogs and the internet magazines go, but you can kind of read some of the quotes in there. But there becomes this kind of struggle around, you know, what these things mean. So the online interviews and discussions around Dollwave, good example of this. They talk about, what is it actually a thing? And this happens in the research stuff as well. Like, if it's a thing, what does the discussion of this stuff even mean? Is there a politics of Dollwave? And it seemed to be associated with rejection of the kind of mainstream politics of Howard and Rudd and Abbott at the time. It's seen as a reaction to kind of right-wing shifts in Australian politics, and much of the lyrics about trying to get by day to day as a young person in life, you know, with precarity and hard to get a job and all that kind of stuff. What's interesting though is that like so-called Dollwave bands, often them, you know, many of the members of them actually had real jobs. So there was a kind of consternation over that kind of stuff as well. So to step back a little bit and to theorize what's going on here, Bourdieu talks about how, you know, there's different levels of power to nominate. The power to name things in the world is really important. And I spoke about that in some depth around hipsters and bogans in the week on that. So Bourdieu sketches out this kind of 3 levels where this activity takes place: the personal, the authorized, and the state. The personal levels are just kind of day-to-day stuff, the way that we talk to each other, slander, accusations, insults, and that kind of thing that happens at a personal level doesn't really necessarily stick and have wider influences, just kind of happens in your own group or family or whatever. The authorized level is kind of more at the level of the critic or the journalist or the author. And this is those with high cultural capital that get to kind of make the world in their own image in that sense. They get to write about things that they're interested in. They get to critique the things they're interested in. And they're in positions where if they kind of call something Dollwave, it'll stick. And that's what happens, I suppose, when something gets into things like the mainstream newspapers. At the highest level, though, there's the state. And it's the kind of key legitimator of what things get to be called, you know, through law and through policy and stuff like that. So in Dollwave, I think it's interesting, right? Because it's an ironic inversion of the state in terms of welfare, but it's done at both the personal and authorized levels. Music writers wrote about it. People in the bands in the scene kind of argued about it. So again, relating to this, like this is where particularly journalists get the way to kind of produce the world in their own image. So in that sense, you know, Dollwave itself isn't really consecrated. It's not like a big deal. And we won't really know its kind of its historical importance till years to come, I suppose, when people are writing backwards looking books and making lists about the best albums and all that kind of stuff. But this is the kind of area I think that's interesting to think about in terms of how things become named, who benefits, and particularly what it's felt like in the scene by people doing this creative work that get given this label that they don't really yet identify with. So I asked about this, and these debates were going on at the time when I was doing the interviews. And so, I asked him, is style wave even a thing? And John says, well, I suppose it's a thing. It's been invented. It's now been written in history books. Don't think people in the bands really subscribe to it. There's the argument that there are very few similarities between those bands to link them as some sort of movement, they're not actually on the dole. Another person says these people that are making the accusations about these bands being middle class, well, generally they're going to be middle class as well. There was a lot of kind of interesting kind of class debate about people in these bands aren't working class. They're not on the dole. They're kind of the kids of middle class parents and all this kind of stuff. But this is an interesting point in a way, kind of making that class analysis that I was talking about before, Axel here. Of course, it's generally middle class people that are most concerned with calling out other people for being middle class. Others kind of say, yeah, it kind of is a thing in a way. I mean, like there's often a sound that links them or a kind of lyrical concern that links them. It's music that was made in Australia, I think this time within a community. So these kind of factors link them together, and now it's been called this thing. What's also interesting about this in terms of stuff I've been talking about previously in the course, and again, this was happening right at the time where the kind of notion of the hipster was a thing, is that there was kind of critique about, dole wave as kind of, is it hipster? Is it just kind of people ironically kind of making art out of, day-to-day life, and, what does that all mean? But also aesthetically, it tends to be pretty, down kind of working class iconographies and symbols, people drinking VB and singlets and flannels and Aussie accents and stuff like that. So this kind of interesting kind of position of, is dole wave aesthetically hipster or bogan? In some respects, producing your music and selling it on tapes and playing little kind of venues that no one knows about is kind of a hipsterish kind of stuff in one way. But the iconography and the concerns are kind of more working class and bogan-esque in other ways. So I think that's kind of, again, relating back to those kind of symbols and figures and class analysis. It kind of shows the kind of fuzzy boundaries between these things. Okay, so to finish, I just got a bunch of links there to some band camps of some of the bands I've been talking about. I think some of them still exist, some of them don't. And in the next section, we're going to be talking with Megan Sharp on some analysis we did, combining some of our research projects together to look at issues of gender and sexuality in the scene. Thanks.